Kia ora, everybody. Welcome to the Conscious Collective show here, and we're extremely excited about the kōrero today with Liz. Liz, welcome to the show.
Kia ora.
It's really wonderful to have you. I'm really fascinated with the work that you've done and that you're continuing to do. I think it is so important. So really excited to delve into that today. I know the work that you're doing is around really telling the stories of kind of pre-colonial Māori parenting, and I'll ask you a little bit more about that. But there was one moment in time that a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I read an article that was written by early missionaries, and it just was a comment on the role of the father, the Māori father, with their Pepi. And I couldn't believe, I had to almost see, like, is this fake news? Like, it was just one of those paradigm shifting moments. And I remember, I've actually got it here, what I read. It was written by a guy called Richard Taylor. And he said, one of the finest traits I have noticed in the New Zealanders is that of parental love. The men appear chiefly to nurse their children and are generally to be seen with one on their back covered up under their mat. The little things appear likewise sensible of their father's love, for they seem principally to cling to them. And, I think my programming and my response to the article is very telling for the story of mainstream media around Māori parenting and whānau. And immediately when I read that, I resonated and thought, this is incredibly powerful and important to share. So when I came across your work, I was very excited. I thought, this is amazing, and the depth that you go into some of this is so needed. So we'll start off by tell us a little bit about how you got into the work that you're doing and why you're so passionate about it.
Kia ora. Little pepeha first. I te taha o tōku matua Tūpuna o Walter Clapham Mountain, ko rākau mangamanga te maunga, ko ipipiri te moana, ko te rāwhiti te marae, ko Ngāti Kuta te hapu, ko Ngapohi te iwi. I te taha o tōku wahine Tūpuna o Emere Makere Waiwaha kā, ko Hikurangi te maunga, ko Waiapu te awa, ko Henepare, ko Ohine Waiapu, ngā marae, ko Ngāti Parau te iwi, ko Helen Mountain Heart tōku māma. Tēnā koe, Ricky, thank you so much for having me today, for inviting me to this kōrero. I'm very chuffed, absolutely, to share these beautiful messages of the gentle and respectful parenting ways of Tūpuna Māori. Ko Elizabeth Harte aho, but you can call me Liz. Everybody does. How did I get into this work? Well, every person has a whakapapa, and Pepi Penapena, which means cherished babies, has a whakapapa too, of course. And it kind of starts with my nanny. So Emere Kā, she was one of New Zealand's first Māori district nurses, working as a nurse in rural, all over Te Motu, all over the country in the 1930s. And so she was teaching whānau about hygiene and health and helping them with their childbirth. She birthed hundreds, perhaps thousands of babies all over the country before she eventually got married and had my whānau. I had my mum and auntie and uncle. And then skipping ahead, when my mum and auntie in the 90s were writing some articles about her life and about her mahi, mum came across a lot of notes of nannies from the time talking about the whānau she was working with in the 1930s and how they lived their lives, and it gave mum an interest. So she went on then and became a researcher in pre-colonial parenting and birthing practices. The birthing stuff is what she started with, and she interviewed a bunch of wahine in the Bay of Islands about their births during the 1930s. And how they were still doing some of those traditional things that our Tūpuna pre-colonial had done. Things like, the the fathers or the husband, a lot of men would help with birthing, and that was more normal for our tūpuna, but they did it in the 1930s still, and there was miri and massage and, you know, waiata and chants during birth. It was great. And then Mum switched to parenting research about pre-colonial Māori when she started, was one of the 3 founders for an organisation, Te Kahui o Manaririki. So she started that with my uncle Hone Ka and my cousin Anton Blanc, who was also a Ka. And she worked there for 10 years doing research and teaching people about the kaupapa. But she parted ways with them in 2017, and then we started Pepi Penapena. And the focus for us was to do a more social sharing of the beautiful kaupapa, and it is beautiful. I mean, and I was learning as Mum was doing her work at Manaririki, and then when Pepi Pena started, you know, we were into the thick of it. And it was great that you pulled out that Richard Taylor quote. That's one of the great ones from these early explorers. But there's actually dozens of quotes from the early explorers that talk about these beautiful parenting ways. That's kind of, and I'm just still every day surprised how little people know. And it's just because the messages aren't mainstream, like you say. You know, that's not taught in schools. It's not talked about on TV. People still talk about once-were warriors. But, you know, like Samuel Marsden in 1814 said, "I saw no quarrelling while I was there. They are kind to their women and children. I never observed either a mark of violence upon them, nor did I ever see a child struck." And it's just kind of those messages are repeated. And it's, why am I passionate about this kaupapa? I'm passionate about this kaupapa because this should be our normal. For Te Ao Māori, this should be what we know and understand as our tūpuna way, as our way of parenting and raising our kids, because it was the Europeans, the pre-colonial Europeans, which had their very different ways, you know, to get into their parenting practices. Of course, when they were colonizing New Zealand during the 1800s, fathers had little or no involvement in child rearing. They expected children to be seen and not heard. Obedience was demanded of kids. And of course, caning and smacking and physical punishment was normal for them. And they imposed all of that onto our much more gentle and respectful ways. Both Mama and Papa did parenting for pre-colonial Māori. Pepi and Tamariki were born with mana, so they were to be respected and their voices heard. And they would be taken to large hui to listen and learn and ask questions. And the questions were never dismissed because these kids had mana. So of course they should be listened to and they should be answered. There's no such thing as a silly question because everything was teaching. So it was really just that those kinds of lessons, they should be our way. I'm determined to try and share the messages as far as wide as I can, like with all of you joining our kōrero today, so then we can try and normalize this and make this the Māori normal, our normal.
Yeah, absolutely. You've touched on so many rich areas that we can delve into, and I'm excited to do that. I mentioned to you before, I came across this resource from Etu Whānau, which we will link into. I've just read it the last couple of days, and I thought, wow, this is an amazing resource alongside the work that you're doing, because it pulls out a lot of those kind of early settler quotes and observations and puts them into a document around how children were treated, what their mana was and within the whānau, and how they interacted, and the role of the wahine and the role of the father, and paint such a different picture to what we may have known. I think what you've alluded to there is so interesting, is that the Europeans have seem to have kind of overlaid their image of parenting, and then created like almost like a image of the worst practices and laid it on Maori, and started to tell that story as the main story, alongside some of the suppression of culture. But really, the story is very different, isn't it?
No, absolutely. Our Tūpuna believe that Pepi were born with mana. They were born with the mana from the atua, from the gods, from the spirit world, and the mana from their Tūpuna, so from their own ancestors. And that with that mana, that meant that they're, even as babies, even as Pepi, they were little people, to be respected and heard and listened to. Even if for a Pepi it's a baby babble and goo goo gaga or a cry kind of thing, that was still Pepi's voice, and Pepi was still trying to engage with you and wanting to get your engagement. So whether they needed something, if they're crying, are they hungry, do they need to be cleaned or something, or if it's a baby babble, they're wanting some attention. And all Pepi and tamariki want attention, because that's also how they learn, by engagement with adults. And in that pre-colonial time, if a kid asked for attention out of turn, by Europeans of the time, they get told to shut up or be quiet, because you don't speak unless you're spoken to, which was also one of those old ways from the Europeans then, that carried through. But that was never the way with Māori. Pepi and tamariki had a voice and had a turn in the conversation. And like I said, in the hui, they can contribute. And it's because Tūpuna wanted their tamariki to grow up bold and brave and independent. It's a common phrase I use, taken from another explorer's quote, Edward Shortland. And they didn't want their kids to be obedient. They wanted them to be independent of thought, curious, exploring. They expected them to make mistakes and try things. That was just all part of them growing up. So they never got angry at them for making mistakes or speaking out of turn, because there was no such thing. They were allowed to speak. They had a voice in the conversation. It's I've said that they were born with mana, but of course they were also born tapu. Tapu gets commonly translated as sacred, of course, kind of a Christian religious association, but it's a protection. They were protected by the atua, and that if you harmed them in any way, then you would get the wrath of the atua. So Tūpuna never wanted to break tapu, because they never wanted to, because they feared that they would get sick or a loved one would die, or that kind of thing. But it meant, though, that for the people or things or places that were tapu, that they were protected, and our Tūpuna did follow that truly. And so by Pepi and tamariki being tapu, that meant that they were protected from harm as well. So they weren't smacked, they weren't even chastised with a yell or a shout, like it's because that was also seen as a verbal harm. I mean, don't get me wrong, kids got told off, but you were trying to not harm them because of their tapu nature. You wanted to protect them, so then they would grow and flourish. So then society would flourish as well. It was a really important part of what tapu was, and what tapu is for Māori.
Right. So it seems like with a lot of indigenous cultures, that they understood what we now understand through neuroscience and attachment theory. They lived it because they followed the biological imperative of the child. Attachment and attuned relationship first. There's another quote, and I'd love to just throw these in throughout the broadcast or the show.
Sure.
And I love this one. It's by George French Angus in 1840. Both parents are almost idolatrously fond of their children. I think that is such a wonderful statement. They like almost see them as gods, you know, that kind of idea of worship to their children. And the father frequently spends a considerable portion of his time in nursing his infant, who nestles in his blanket and is lulled to rest by some native song. It's amazing, which we'll talk about soon. The children are cheerful and lively little creatures, full of vivacity and intelligence. They pass their early years almost without restraint, amusing themselves with the various games of the country. Sounds like a childhood that is going to create very strong and independent, creative thinkers.
Absolutely. And like that quote also says, I mean, both the quotes you pulled out, of course, have that father focus. I think that's one of the more interesting things I've learned about Tūpuna Māori parenting is the role of the father, papa. It was again the Europeans that really pressed that idea that, you know, dads aren't involved with child rearing and with looking after the kids. That's women's work, and those were European ideas. The number of explorers who noted that how involved fathers were, and that they would nurse and cuddle and coo, and you know they were really involved parents. Indeed, once kids were weaned, so once they were off breast milk, the boy kids were often raised by dad almost exclusively. So he would look after the boy babies, and mama would look after the girl babies. I mean, I'm sure there was variations between hapu and iwi, but it was once bub was weaned, then dad could get involved. And so you'd have these kids being in the baby carrier in te piko, sometimes all day with dad while he went hunting or while he went gardening, or you know, maybe he was out on the waka where there's artworks of a person, could be a man or a woman, hard to tell, but wearing a pepi on their back while they're on the waka. You know, it's the te piko was not just an occasional use thing, it was a regular use thing. It was when you've got small pepi, unless you're at home and they're down on the mats in that safe place kind of thing, you were out and about. Pepi was with you. It's not like there was any prams. So the te piko was the way that you took your kids everywhere, but even once they were weaned. And so we're talking about older kids, you know, they've got teeth and stuff, they're eating food now. Even though they could probably walk, they would still get carried around in te piko to go with their parents and see how they worked and see what they did. And that was another way of them learning about the world, is just by observing the everyday work of mama and papa, whether it was, you know, mum doing some cooking or going to do some gardening, or, you know, or dad taking them on a long journey, or taking them to a hui, taking them to a meeting. I think that was a really cool thing that I kind of have learned through all of this, is how important te piko was and how involved the fathers were. And actually, even though there's not a lot of artworks, I only found 2 so far, of papa wearing pepi, carrying pepi in te piko, according to some explorers, dads wore them more than mums did. And that you know, dad was bigger and stronger, and so if they're going on a big walk or whatever, dad would carry a kid. But of course, in that European lens at the time, they filtered the view of the world, and they really only showed mama doing the carrying, but it wasn't necessarily like that. Yeah, the fathers had a really important role.
How have you integrated that into your parenting with your children? Tell us a little bit about your whānau and how that's impacted. And you know, we're finding ourselves in a different context. It feels that, you know, we've gone away from kind of like village living and whānau based care. How have you found? What are you doing? And yeah, let us in a little bit on your world.
Sure. I wouldn't say I'm you know, taking all of it on. Like you say, there's context and every whānau is different. So my whānau, I've got a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and then a 4-month-old. And so my husband and I have a whare together with all of them. And I guess in terms of just my interactions with them, I mean, some of this stuff has come from learning the kaupapa and actually, you know, reading and learning and then applying to kids. But some of it I also realized has come from my own mama. You know, how you are raised often instinctively becomes how you raise your kids in a lot of ways. And so my brother and I always had a voice at home. I was perhaps a spirited and outspoken child, and my parents nurtured and encouraged that. And we were always talking at home, and there was always stories and reading and books and songs and that engagement and back and forth. And so instinctively, naturally, I'm doing that with my own kids. You know, we're always talking about how things work and what did you do today, or and how did you build that. And it's that korero, that communication and getting them thinking and getting them involved and telling them about the world is a big part. But I guess the challenging bit, of course, is, and this is the bit where learning comes in. My whānau we're not a smacking whānau, so that was something that we agreed anyway up front. But I still have trouble with my volume. I still have to catch myself on the yell if something's not going smoothly. Sibling rivalry has been the big thing between the 2 and the 4-year-old, and then you're still trying to explain and have guidelines and rules, but at the same time you want child 1 to stop biting child 2, please.
Real thing in every family.
So you end up with some practicalities there of actually trying to get them apart, but still then also explain, though that was his toy, I know you wanted it, and that made you really grumpy, but you're not allowed to bite him just because you want the toy, darling. And that's parenting. Changing your parenting ways and changing your parenting instincts is a challenge. It's something I mention in my my korero I do on my Facebook page all the time, is that it's not a magic switch that you're going to be able to flip and just start parenting like our Tūpuna did. It's a journey, and it's something to just consciously be aware of, and you know, you'll get better and better at it the more and more you practice. So I feel I'm in a much better place now than I would have been if I didn't know this kaupapa. The volume would have been dire, I'm sure. But I'm on my journey, and the sibling rivalry is testing every day. But that's one of the key ways I'm applying Tūpuna ways to everyday parenting for me.
Yeah, what I find with parenting, and you know, I've got a 8-year-old, and 9-year-old, and 2 13-year-olds. So in our whānau, so have come kind of through the early years, the intensity of that nurturing requirement, and now facing a whole set of different worlds. Sibling rivalry is always there. But I'm finding the big shift that's come for me with parenting recently has been, number one, kindness to yourself is super important. You know, if we hold ourselves to these extreme measures of what a good parent is, and constantly feel like we're failing, that's gonna cause a lot of shame, and probably almost worsen the way that we interact with our children, because it just reminds us that we're not good enough. But the second thing is if we can become aware of our triggers and the things that we that makes us react, then we can also become really aware of some of the unhealed emotions in ourselves. You know, I find with my children, as you know, my 8 or 9-year-old struggles with school, or my 13-year-old has big emotions that I may not have been allowed to have. Those are all moments where I feel uncomfortable or I want to react, but I understand that actually I'm again the 8-year-old, you know, there's that 8-year-old within me, my inner child, or that 4-year-old, or that is just asking to be loved, it's asking to be guided. So parenting has become a really healing journey for me as well, because yeah, it's nothing quite like your own children to mirror back to you what's going on inside of you.
I couldn't agree more, absolutely. And you're definitely right about being kind to yourself as well, and particularly when you've got the younger Pepi as well. You know, you're still on the 2 wake ups a night and all the rest kind of thing. Some days are going to be easier than others, and you just got to be okay with how the day rolls. However that's going to roll.
And you've got 3 under 5, you're doing the work, you're here doing a korero with us. I mean, sometimes it's like just giving ourselves a little bit of a pat on the back. we're doing okay. We're doing okay. And of course, one of the things that seems to be quite different in modern society is the way that we're a little bit isolated from extended whānau in the ways of connection, which makes it so much more pressure on the parent to be all things to all people. What have you found? Is that something that you think is true?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think every whānau again is different, and some people live in the city and some people live, you know, far away from their whānau or live rurally, and so, you know, even though your whānau is close, they're not actually close. But I think there are a lot of whānau who do still get that support from their extended. I know that we make good use of, well, previously my mum, so I suppose I didn't mention in my introduction that the reason it's me doing these korero and not mum, of course, is she passed away last year from breast cancer, and so I took a break from all Pepi Penapena stuff last year, and I've only really gotten back into the groove of it this year, kind of for her legacy. But of course, with my older kids, when they were younger, she was a big part of our kāinga, our village, and so she was doing daycare pickups and, you know, having them for an afternoon, and I'd go and drop them off, or one or the other. And now it's my husband's whānau, so his parents and his brother-in-law and their whānau are just wonderful, and we all share the care of our kids together, and Rob's parents in particular love spending time with their mokopuna and are just so supportive, and I make as much use of them as they'll let me, really, because I trust them, and my kids love going there. Yeah, and so I think it's about building a kāinga, building a support framework that works for you, and making sure that you do trust. I mean, you know, I of course trust Rob's parents and his brother-in-law and their family, but if you're not sure about some of your whānau or some of your friends or whatever who want to be part of your kāinga, but you're not sure about them, then, you know, it's trying to be strong to say, well, maybe they're not the right people to look after my kids. It's back in the day for pre-colonial Māori, the kāinga was that extended whānau, and you'd have multiple whānau units in the kāinga, but really it was all one whānau in that village, in that kāinga, and it was kind of self-policing, I guess. There's got to be a better word for it, but you know, some of the explorers observed that, you know, so kids weren't struck. There's no smacking, but if a child was struck, actually that adult would get penalised by the others in the village, in the kāinga. It wasn't condoned. So whether it would be that that whānau might have some pigs taken from them, was one of the observations. Or in another case, a wahine who had smacked a child was, not that I condone it, but was in turn then punished herself, saying, no, that's not how we do things. Keep your hands to yourself. How do you like it? But it's even still, it was that self-policing, that you had such rare instances, because actually everybody kept an eye on each other and everybody supported each other. Whāngai, adopting kids was so common because you'd never let a whānau get overburdened with too many kids. So if they had lots of young kids, then someone, be it the grandparents or an auntie or uncle, would adopt that the youngest child out to ease that burden and make sure that that child had the best childhood possible. So that was the kainga, that was the support, the whanaungatanga throughout is I could see how it would have worked with all those close whānau together.
So I suppose the child was born among a worldview or tikanga that, like you said, that the children are taonga, a treasure, they are tapu. So the whole village would have come kind of like bought into the ideas, the cultural values, and together that's what tends to happen with self-policing, is that if there's a shared value and a shared view of who children are and how they are in the world and how we interact with them. And would you say it's fair that potentially some of that knowledge has been lost among mainstream currently?
I think a lot of Māori may know, well, they may not, but that Pepi are born with mana. I feel, I'm not sure if this is true, that a lot of people believe that mana is something you earn with age and earn with experience, because there's like a mana tangata, kind of the mana of people, which you earn through leadership and service, to your marae or community or whānau, and I wonder if some people only think of that mana and don't necessarily think that this wee pepi that you're holding in your hands also has mana. It's just it's mana they were born with from their tūpuna and from the atua. So I think, some of that, a lot of that shared knowledge, or a lot of that knowledge that made that kainga system work, has been lost. It was stamped out by the Europeans with they had a lot of laws to stamp out using Māori, to ban tohunga. So tohunga were the spiritual leaders. Well, they were leaders. They were experts in lots of different areas of Te Ao Māori, but there was a law at one stage to make them illegal. It was the Europeans did all sorts for the betterment of Māori, of course, to stamp out the culture. And so it's just all got lost. But of course, we've been reclaiming so much and relearning so much. And parenting is one of these areas where there's still so much more to learn.
Let's talk a little bit more about mana atua. And I saw a post that you wrote, and you said it so beautifully, that there are many atua, and they all have characteristics and gifts and talents and different ways of being, and that it's the child who's born with the infinite potential, I suppose, of all atua. How do you see that?
I guess it's the mana atua. Mana atua, born with mana. It is that potential. So it's with Pepi being born with that mana and born with that potential on board. It means that they've got this foundation to learn and to grow and to become wonderful people, kind of thing. They just need nurturing, they need teaching, and and that they're able to take all this on board. And so the mana atua part is the acknowledging that Pepi are born with their own innate personalities and traits, and that they blossom through as they grow up. And so often you'll be able to acknowledge or see different atua in your Pepi, in your tamariki, because the different atua have different personalities, strengths and skills. But I'm probably not going to, there is a whole kōrero perhaps around the different atua and what those traits are and that kind of thing, but that's not really my kaupapa. I'm very aware that there's the wonderful Dr. Dai and Mark Kopua, who are the experts in this area. They have an organisation, Mahi Atua, and so there's a kōrero that they did during lockdown, I think, that's online somewhere that you can find, and they talk a lot about the different personalities and traits of some of these atua. So I'll probably park the conversation there because it's on that bit, just because it's not I could speak to it, but it's not mine to speak to, if that makes sense. But yeah,
in a beautiful direction, and we'll try and find it and link it in the comments, because I think I would definitely be very interested in listening.
Absolutely. No, I'll share the link with you after. But then in terms of mana tūpuna as well, it's acknowledging that in your genealogy and your heritage, you have inherited these innate skills from your tūpuna, whatever their talents and greatness is now in you. And so for Pepi and Tamariki is to help them realize this potential. And like you said, neuroscience and all the rest has been, in some cases, relatively recently catching up on some of this stuff. And it's just so cool to be able to line those up, that all Pepi, barring rare genetic issues and whatever, but all Pepi are born with the same brain, and that brain is capable of learning and growing to create a wonderful, intelligent person. And that first year of life is really a critical part of all of that in terms of the engagement that you have with Pepi and that kōrero, even if it's baby babble, that kōrero, having that, the Harvard researchers call it the serve and return, but it's if baby coos at you, you engage and talk back with them, and it gets that brain firing up. But all Pepi are born with that potential and that wonderful brain that will grow into this great person. And our tūpuna believed it too. They just considered it as part of the mana. Pepi's born with this mana, this foundation, this potential to grow into a great and productive person in society. And it's very cool to be able to see those line up and be like, our tūpuna knew. He knew.
Absolutely. I think if you told someone 300 years ago that there is a molecule inside your blood and everywhere in your saliva, and you can't see it, but it's there, and it encodes, has the history and the information of your entire ancestral line coded in its mix, and it's what actually informs how your cells are formed. I think they would have thought you're speaking some really deep mystical language, but of course that's exactly what we're finding out with DNA. So it's an absolutely amazing thing that although we didn't see with the microscope back then, or some of the instruments and tools that we now have, there is a deeper intelligence, a higher intelligence of ways of being that is intuitive into all humanity, really. And I think the more we understand of indigenous ways of being, is the more we can align some of what modern science is saying with actual healthy lifestyles for modern humanity as well.
Absolutely, totally agree.
I want to go back to one of the quotes I think that I read talked about the father singing traditional songs to his infant, and I've come across the oriori a couple of times, and again it was one of those pinch myself moments when I came across it. It's like, wow, this is just one of the most incredible practices that that is so ingrained in kind of the ways of being for Māori, or were so ingrained. Tell us a little bit about the oriori and the waiata that was created for Pepi.
Sure. So waiata oriori, it sometimes gets translated as traditional lullabies, but they're really a whole lot more than that. Of course, that quote that you referred to, you know, Pepi was lulled to sleep with a native song, which likely would have been an oriori. And there's other references to the songs helping Pepi go back to sleep. But some of these oriori, they're the content of them is meaty. You know, there's so much more to them than that. They're meaty, but they're also magic. I mean, they're songs, they're chants, they're poems, but that they wrote for the birth of a Pepi, and they were written by the parents or the grandparents. You know, a lot of papa would write them, and they had a few different purposes. So they were sometimes simply to welcome Pepi to Te Ao, to the world. They would also sometimes talk about their whakapapa and talk about their ancestors, their tūpuna, and where they came from. And by acknowledging the greatness that they came from, because of course they knew that Pepi had mana tūpuna, they were born with mana tūpuna, then they're saying, this is the mana that you are inheriting. This is your whakapapa, where it comes from. It would also reference different atua, different gods in them, to say that these are the strengths that you could inherit from mana atua, and they're always you know, extolling. They wanted the absolute best for their Pepi. I mean, they were always trying to say the absolute best things they could. They're always so proud. I guess it was a very child-centric society, and there was nothing more precious than a Pepi. And so they would also talk about the hopes and dreams for their future, and so what Pepi would potentially achieve in future, be a great warrior, or, you know, that kind of thing. But the old oriori, and so there's quite a few documented in Serapiranga Nata. Wrote these volumes, Namo Teatea, these they're hugely want to document all the waiata, both waiata aroha and waiata tangi and oriori from our people, and there's a lot of waiata oriori in there, but some of those old ones were long, so it's kind of, for a Pepi, you know, practically as a lulling chant kind of thing, you probably would put Pepi to sleep. But in the writing of them, of course, they are like poetry, and the Mãori is very beautiful, very advanced. But you know, there's a lot of layers to some of them in terms of the imagery and stuff. And they told how special Pepi was for the whānau, and so they would sing them to Pepi. But they would also sing them during the Te Rite Pure ceremony. It's one of the newborn ceremonies welcoming Pepi, the tohi ceremonies. They would sing it as part of that. They would also sing them at hui, because sometimes they were great to sing to manuhiri, to tell them about a particular child or a particular person. So you don't just sing it when the Pepi is little. As they grow up, this is still their waiata oriori. So you could sing it later in life. And it kind of reminded everyone, again, it's that shared value thing. It reminded everyone how much they loved and adored and were proud and had such great expectations of their Pepi and tamariki by writing these waiata oriori and then singing them, chanting them, sharing them. So then those messages were repeated, reiterated. Yeah, so they're so much more than a lullaby.
It's like a customized, individualized lullaby for every child that reminds them of their own greatness, and that is then adopted by the village. So whenever they're unsure, I suppose, of who am I, where do I belong, this anchors them deeply into, kind of like orientates them into, you know, space and time and belonging. And
absolutely,
for children and for all humans, that's something that we long for. It's like, where do I belong? Who am I? what am I here for? And so to have that as an anchor for a child that's held within the village, it's just absolutely amazing.
Absolutely,
really beautiful. So I think we'll almost wrap up. I've really loved the kōrero today. Many of our audience are early childhood teachers and educators, and are working with both Māori and non-Māori tamariki and whānau. What do you think what would be your main message to our educators, do you think? What's the most important thing for us to understand and to know, as we're kind of like the front-facing village of the new village, I suppose, working with whānau and tamariki?
Aye. Well, from my understanding, you guys already have, or some of you have already learnt quite a few of these principles through Te Whāriki. And so the work that was done and pulled together for Te Whāriki is a great foundation for some of these concepts and things. So you guys are already on that journey just by having that mātauranga, that knowledge. But yeah, you also have this opportunity because you know this knowledge and you're engaging with whānau who have young children, that you could almost in an indirect way perhaps share pearls of wisdom. I mean, this is, you know, every centre works differently and every teacher works differently, of course, but that if you're having that kōrero at the end of the day with mama or papa or whoever's picking the child up, trying to make sure trying to tell a story about something that happened that day and how that interaction went. You know, what you talked about or the questions you asked. I mean, it's not going to be every day that you do it, I guess, but every now and then you'd have the opportunity to say, your son did something really amazing today. He all by himself made a seesaw with his friends in the back garden without our guidance, and they all played together, and he played really well and was having a great conversation with his friends, or whatever. And so showing the ingenuity, highlighting the conversation, that, you know, he was trying something out and it worked. I don't know, I guess it's the values, the principles of kaupapa Māori parenting, and kind of not necessarily telling whānau about it, but showing them examples of it through your dealings with their kids. It's perhaps a gentle way to share some of these things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I nearly forgot to touch on this, but I think it's such an interesting point. One of your videos, you quote a whakatauki, and I'll attempt it here. Tā te tamariki, tāna nei mahi, wa wahi taha. And I'll get you to translate that for us maybe, and just tell us a little bit. But for me, it frames this view of the child and discipline and how we view, you know, kind of go about that interaction with young children.
Aye. So that's a great whakatauki, wonderful one, and it translates to, it is the job of the child to smash the calabash. A calabash was a valuable tool. It was like a gourd that was used for carrying water and food. So perhaps you could say it's like, you know, spilt milk, the European proverb. But the Māori meaning for the whakatauki was that kids will make mistakes, kids will break rules, kids will be naughty, and that's all part of their job as kids. And that's what our tūpuna expected of them. So they never got angry at them or you know, for their mistakes or naughty behavior. Indeed, one of the explorers said that they were more likely to smile at naughty behavior than to get angry, because it was a teaching opportunity. So every time they make a mistake or do something wrong or test a rule, it's an opportunity to explain and to teach. So then they learn more about te ao, and they learn with their ears, not with the smack or being yelled at. Tūpuna didn't punish in that way. Of course, the Europeans introduced all of that and the cane and everything else. But Tūpuna, before the Europeans got in the way, they absolutely believed this whakatauki and that nature of tamariki, because they wanted them to be, like I said before, bold and brave and independent, and they wanted them to, you know, explore. And it was also kind of that, it was perhaps what made Māori such great warriors, is that they were bold and independent of thought and heart and mind from such a young age, and they wanted those skills to be carried through into adulthood. And so they never wanted to smack them because it would break their spirit, they feared, and, you know, damage their tapu and anger the atua. But having that independence all the way through, then when they became warriors, you know, they were already bold. They didn't have to teach them bravery. They just then had to learn skills. And because they had already spent their whole childhood learning with their ears, they already knew how to learn as well, and be taught how to use all these weapons, and to be taught strategies, and to work as a team, work as an army, you know, more or less, because they had been taught how to learn right from a young age without the smack. It's just, those warriors were raised gently, and those warriors raised their Pepi and tamariki gently too. It didn't make them lesser warriors, it made them greater. I think that's feels like a contradiction for some people, but a warrior doesn't have to be hard, which is what some people believe. I mean, you know, they need to be bold and brave and independent to get out there. Anyway, it's
when you threaten a child, or when it's smacked, and it puts them into a flight or fight response, we now know what they knew back then, that literally it stops the growth of the creative, bold intelligence centers of the brain. And so, yeah, if your outcome is to create a protective village and a strong army, not that that's what they'd call it, but then you want those who've had the complex centers of the brain really well developed. And you don't get that through smacking, you don't get that through anger and putting the child into a state of fear. You get that through nurturing, you get that through putting them actually in a state of love. So that's a really interesting comment. I love that. The job of the child is to make mistakes. The job of the child is to test the boundaries. The job of the child is to be cheeky. And if we can understand just that, I think that it will start to reframe how we interact, and when we meet those behaviors with a smile, because we've been taught, unless you're strong on those behaviors and really firm in your discipline, then they're never going to learn, and they're just going to think it's okay, right? But the natural way of attachment is actually when the relationship is strong, they want to emulate and be close and please and listen and learn. So
yeah, and there was yet another, I'm seeing if I can find it, yet another quote that related to that. No, I don't have it here. That you know, that the explorer observed how good-natured and compliant the children were, despite not being struck, despite not being smacked. They were surprised that they were, lovely little kids that actually did what they were told and all that kind of thing, because they had been given that respect and understanding from a young age. I'll see if I can find it after, and maybe we can share it in the comments too.
Absolutely. I mean, I think about, again, Reverend Samuel Marsden saying there are no finer kids than the kids of New Zealanders. Like talking about ones who aren't scared of being confident talking to strangers, and really, really beautiful.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. If people want to connect to your work, support your work, where do they go? What's the best way?
I try to post every week on Facebook on Pepi Penapena is my Facebook page. But I also do have a website. I probably need to update a little more often, but pepipenapena.co.nz. And there's quite a lot of research there, and some more of these explorers' quotes and references if people are interested. But if I ask one thing of any of you listening today, it would be to talk about this kaupapa. If anything even lightly related comes up that alludes to some of this, share what you've learned. It's the only way the knowledge is really going to become normal, and is that if we talk about it and make it normal. It's with your friends, with your whānau. Let's share the message far and wide, please.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Liz. What a wonderful kōrero this has been. And it will be my mission to share it as far and wide as we can, because I think it's really important. Have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you for your time. And I look forward to connecting again sometime soon.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Ricky.